Hi, I'm Elizabeth Khuri Chandler. I'm a journalist and writer who co-founded the website Goodreads, a community for people like me who live for books. For this podcast, we go back to the basics. One-on-one conversations with authors, artists, explorers, and entrepreneurs. People with big ideas, people who have changed the world. Answering the question, what are the books of your life? Melinda Gates has many facets. She's the mother of 3 children. She has dual degrees in computer science and economics and an MBA. She worked at Microsoft for many years. She's married to the billionaire founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates. Plus, she's the co-founder and president of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Together, they've given away billions of dollars trying to solve some of the world's thorniest problems. They've focused on many important issues, including women's empowerment and contraceptive use. Now, Melinda Gates has written her first book. It's called The Moment of Lift. It's a call to action for women's empowerment and full of life lessons she's learned traveling the planet as a philanthropist. Melinda joined me from Seattle to talk about her most important books and about her moment of lift, which begins with her embracing the identity of a feminist.
When I first was posed the question about was I a feminist, it was actually by a nun here in Seattle, and I was going to give a talk at the all-girls school that she was running, and we were talking about what topics might be of interest to the girls, and she said, well, I don't know if you're a feminist. Would you be willing to talk about that? And she stopped me dead in my tracks because it was 1996, and I had just left Microsoft at the birth of our first daughter, and I realized that I hadn't really wrestled with the word, that I really didn't think of myself at the time as a feminist. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Maybe most strongly is that I knew many of the negative connotations that had been put on that label. But as I began to do this work at the foundation and began learning about the difference that women's equality makes all over the world for women's lives and their kids' lives, I realized, okay, if feminism means a woman having her full voice and her full decision-making authority in every part of her life, home, community, and workplace, then I am an ardent feminist, and I have more than fully embraced the title now, or that word.
And in your choice of women's empowerment, why did you choose this as the most important issue?
Because it is the most important issue. Equality can't wait. If we want society to change and to be inclusive of everybody, if you believe, as I do and Bill does, that all lives have equal value, you have to embrace women, and you have to make sure that women are lifted up and have their full voice and decision-making authority and power in society. And what I have come to see from all over the world is that when that happens, it lifts up communities and it lifts up societies, and life becomes better for everybody in those countries.
Was it a surprise to you that that would be the issue?
Yes, absolutely. When I got into this foundation work, we were working on very, what I would call technical solutions, and we still are. By technical solution, I mean a vaccine. A vaccine absolutely saves children's lives, and we still do that work. It's some of the work Bill and I are the most proud of. I never, ever thought that by working, for instance, on vaccines or HIV/AIDS or malaria, that would lead me into realizing we needed to focus on gender. But it would be as I was out in so many remote villages or in townships talking with women and talking with them about the difference vaccines made in their children's lives, that when I stayed long enough and let them ask questions of me, so many women all over the world would turn the conversation, to my surprise, to contraceptives. And they'd say to me, we're talking about vaccines in the health clinic right over there across the road, but why aren't you talking to me about contraceptives? Why could I get contraceptives there maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I can't get them anymore? This is a life and death crisis for me. I can't have another child. I can't feed another child right now. And so that is what drove me to start to look at the contraceptive issue, which then drove me to say, oh my gosh, we not only need to make sure as a world that women have access, voluntary access to contraceptives. It's the greatest anti-poverty tool we have. But we need to look at all kinds of women's equality issues if we're going to raise women up all over the world.
You write in your book that you often worry about the people I will fail if I don't get it right. And that's not an inconsequential worry when you're talking about giving away billions upon billions of dollars. How do you personally gauge whether or not you're getting it right?
Well, we try and measure all of our work, and that's not easy. I mean, we often have to set up an organization or use an organization that exists, but make sure that they have the capability of measuring our work so we can see. I mean, I look at how on track are we to reach these 200 million women asking us for contraceptives. So we have to try and be very pragmatic about measuring our work. We have to actually reach out to critics because often people don't want to critique our foundation or sound critical because then they think, oh, well, I might not get funding. So it's challenging, to be honest, in the philanthropy space, way more challenging than it is in business. In business, you have customers, you have immediate feedback, you have all kinds of feedback loops. But in philanthropy, that's less true. And so we've had to really work at that over time.
As someone who concentrates on these big issues, curing diseases, ending poverty, are there things around you that you see people worrying about, or even things in your own life that used to bother you that now seem trivial?
Oh my gosh, yes. So I'll give you an example. I went into a health, fitness club recently, and there was a woman there that for whatever reason, when she went into her locker, I guess this particular fitness club gives you robes that you get to wear. And she was so frustrated because whoever had refilled the lockers in this fitness club had forgotten to put a sash on her robe. And she said kind of out loud to herself or to me, I already gave them feedback on this, and it's the third time they've happened. Why can't they learn to get this right? And I had to turn away because I was so aghast, and I thought, oh my gosh, if you're complaining about the sash on your robe, I wish you had just been on the trip that I'd been on to see women carrying water from kilometers and kilometers from a dirty water pan to their home and then heating it and boiling it for their children. And so it just really shocked me. And it made me all the more determined to look at where am I like that in life. Of course, we all have normal things that irritate us. Somebody cuts you off in traffic or something doesn't work around your house but I try to look at those pretty carefully and figure out, okay, is this really something I want to complain about or spend my energy on? And then I try to remember people that I met in the developing world who are living in unbelievably different circumstances. And I think the other thing you can do when things are irritants to you in your life is you can just bring some gratitude to the situation. So if I get cut off in traffic, and it's irritating to me, I can say to myself, yeah, but I was lucky this morning. I woke up and I turned that water faucet on and I had a warm, clean shower. Wow. How lucky is that? So I think if you learn, at least for me, I've tried to learn to bring gratitude to those situations, maybe not that specific one that I'm irritated about, but something else in my day. And believe me, then it takes the irritation down really, really quickly.
Yeah. I think that's a good lead into some of these books that you've recommended, which are an amazing list. I was so excited when I got these books. But one of the first ones that you mentioned is Awakening Joy by James Baraz and Shoshana Alexander. And it's a book with 10 steps towards happiness. Gratitude is prevalent in that. One of the key steps that I really liked was how you change the word I have to do something to I get to do something. And I just wanted to know, how did you come across this book and what principles have you applied to your life from this book?
This book was just like one of my top all favorite books because the woman who recommended it to me is one of my walking partners, Charlotte Guyman, who I write about in my book, Moment of Lift. Her son was studying at Stanford at the time, and he's a computer science engineering graduate. So he's studying at Stanford. And I knew her son, literally, I went and visited her the day he was born in the hospital. And so here's this young man that I've watched grow up and who I just, am so lucky to have gotten to know. And he's studying computer science at Stanford. And yet the book that he wanted to recommend to his mom and that she recommended to me then was Awakening Joy, because he said it transformed how he looked at life. And so I read that book and I read it front to back. And then I read it again, chapter by chapter, very slowly over the course of a year. I must have carried that book around for almost 2 years in my purse because I felt like there were so many lessons in it that I could apply to my life. And I would say the first one is absolutely gratitude. Gratitude for what we have. I have gratitude for waking up in the Pacific Northwest and there's clean air, right? I've traveled to Bangladesh. You wake up and it is not clean air there. Or, the fact that, that I have an office where I can look out the window. I love nature. So anyway, I've just really learned to have a lot of gratitude in my life, even during really, really difficult times that I've gone through. Some, I talk about in my book where I had some abuse in my past. And when I was working through that, those were very difficult days for me. I could still reach for moments of joy by having gratitude. And it just helps with your perspective.
There's so many great quotes in that book.
Mm-hmm.
I love the thing about how he says, no matter how good things are, they will change. And the more you hold on, the more you suffer. And I like to hang on to things like till the bitter end. And it just really kind of shook me up a little bit.
Yeah. And the person that you're hurting the most, me too, is yourself. I think it's in that book, right, that he uses the example of a monkey that puts their hand in a gourd. And when they reach into the gourd to grab, the banana that's inside, they don't unball their fist. And so they can't get their paw back out. And you realize when you grasp and hold on to something, it's not until you release that the emotion can let go.
Well, you had 2 books that had the word awakening in them.
I know. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. No, I definitely, these are big, kind of expansive books. All the books you picked were very expansive to me. So let's talk a little bit about the Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo, who's a poet who had cancer, and then once he recovered, wanted to bottle light and give it to people going through dark times. And I think it was an email exchange, and then it became a book. How did you come across this book?
My sister-in-law gave this to me for my birthday one year. And she knew that I was doing an exploration of my spirituality. She's actually in my spirituality group. And she just thought somehow this book might speak to me. And I opened it the next morning to read the day's passage that was in there, and I just couldn't believe it. And I haven't put the book down since. It goes all over the world with me. That book has been to Senegal and South Africa and Tanzania and India. So it's like the one book that I pack for sure on every trip. And if you saw it, it's marked up, it's tabbed. But I go to it every morning, and I went to it this morning. And I don't necessarily read what is for that day. I more just open it and see what comes. But it has been a really instrumental book in my life. And it's funny because when I was writing this list up of the books I wanted to give you, because, it's hard to pick your sort of top 5 or 6 favorite books, it struck me too that, isn't that interesting? 2 of the books on my list I hadn't even realized had the word awakening in them. And if and in my book, my journey through this foundation work, really, if you think about it, now that I'm sitting here thinking about this, it really is an awakening for me. What I've learned through this journey of philanthropy and speaking with other women all over the world, it's been an awakening to different points of views, to seeing the world, seeing myself, seeing the U.S. in different ways. And that, for me, has been an awakening. In fact, Mark Nepo talks about somewhere in that book that it's like if you have a headlight on a car, as you drive your car around in the city or whatever, a film comes over it. And it's not until you start to rub that film away, which is what you have to do with your spirituality on your soul, is to rub the film away until you have a clear light and a clear way of seeing. And, the title of my book, Moment of Lift, I talk about early on in the book that it really comes from the Apollo space launches that I got to watch as a little girl in my jammies with my sister. My dad was an Apollo engineer. He'd take us to a friend's house who was an Apollo engineer with my mom and my sister, and we'd go watch, that rumbling and that whole amazing moment when, the spaceship, the rocket leaves the ground and pushes against the forces of gravity, holding it down. So that moment of lift for me is like those Apollo rocket launches. But also, I pulled from a Mark Nepo book I loved. One of my favorite words is grace. And he talks about a moment of lift being like a moment of grace. And believe me, I've had times in my life where I don't know where to go or what to turn to next. And what I most do is pray for a moment of grace to enter the scene so that I say the right thing or do the right thing, or I find a way through something difficult.
Let's talk a little bit about Sapiens, which is another amazing book, and again has such this global view. I mean, it's looking at patterns in human society. Is that what's appealing to you about that book? Like, how did you come across that book, and why is it one of your top books?
Someone gave that book, someone from Silicon Valley, a friend of Bill's, gave it to Bill to read for his birthday. And he read it, and Bill is a voracious reader, so he'll often recommend books to me, but he's recommending so many, that I have trouble kind of sifting through them. But he'd read it, and I knew it had a big impact on him. And it's funny because he didn't say to me, you should read it, but after one day I just kind of read the back of it, and I said, well, remind me who gave it to you, et cetera, and he told me. And I opened the first 2 pages, and I'm like, wow. This is a book I want to read. And I said to Bill, do you think I would like this book? He said, yeah, I think you'd really like it. And I think what I loved about it, again, was it took this macro view of the world and explained some things throughout time, but then really, at least for me, I will say, challenged me to think about different pieces of things or think about ways society got organized from a different point of view. One of the things that I had great mathematics in high school. That was a big plus for my Catholic school, great social justice upbringing, but honestly, not fabulous world history. And so that's a piece that I've filled in over the last 20 years traveling the world. And so for me, this was a great way to also fill in some pieces of my knowledge that I didn't even quite realize I had. And it just was a very, as you said, expansive book for me and for my thinking.
Which, I mean, it seems like it dovetails nicely with the work you're doing on the foundation, which is looking at these wide global patterns and problems.
For sure.
The one thing I also noticed in the moment of lift is you reference it, because you talked about Hammurabi's code and how women's value was half of a male commoner, and that's from 1776 BC in Babylon, and I mean, you think about it, and those are the forces that women are working against, these historical laws that are still, in some places being perpetuated today.
Right. And then you go see something like Hamilton, and you think about how our Constitution was written and how women didn't get the right to vote, and Black people were only considered part of a human being. And you think about what that did to the hierarchy of our society and what it said about who was valued and who counted. And so then when I think forward and I think about AI, artificial intelligence, I think, oh my gosh, because women very, very, very few women have a seat at that table in who's creating AI, and yet it is profoundly going to change our lives and is beginning to, but the effects are so far reaching. We are baking bias into AI by women and people of different ethnicities not having a seat at the table, much like we baked bias into the United States by the way the Constitution was written, much like bias was written into society by the hierarchy set up by the Harambe Code. So you just have to look at how the dots connect and say, whoa, that's something I want to make sure we do something about.
That's really interesting. Are you doing anything to help alter the development of AI to make sure that we have more voices at the table?
I am. So an office that I have separate from the foundation is called Pivotal, and it really works on issues in the United States. And one of them is, how do we really get more women into technology? How do we create more pathways more role models? And then one piece of it is specifically looking at AI, because we've just got to have more women in that field.
Well, the last book is just the Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, and I think that ties into this idea of self-worth. One of the key things that I think is fascinating about that book is how it talks about people who are able to be imperfect but not think that makes them unworthy. How did you find this book? What do you think is important about it? Why should everybody read it?
Well, I first came across Brene Brown's work when I saw her amazing TED Talk shortly after she did it, and it went viral. And I started following her after that to see what else she was going to put out, either talks or books. And so I started to follow her work. And when this book came out, I scooped it up right away and read it. And the thing that was just instrumental to me is the opening of that book, where she talks about the fact that it's the person in the arena doing the work, not the critics sitting on the side, who should be counted. It's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And I thought, yeah, that's right. Like, I should be willing in my work. I had just begun to be far more courageous. I had just stepped out earlier that year on contraceptives and raising an enormous fund worldwide to try and give access to women, for women to contraceptives around the world. But I thought, when I read her book, Daring Greatly, I thought, yeah, that's who I want to be. That's what I want to do in the world. And I need to not worry so much about the critics. And then she also talks about authenticity and vulnerability in that book. And it helped me realize that those are traits not only that I have, but that I wanted to make sure showed up in my leadership more, that I shouldn't hide those traits from people when I'm leading, but I should actually expose them and make it more okay for others to lead in that model.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Melinda. I really appreciate it. I think a lot of people will get a lot out of these book recommendations, not just me. And on a personal level, thank you for writing The Moment of Lift. It was very helpful, and I'm glad that you're daring in your life, and I will take that as an inspiration too.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thanks also for sharing your personal part of it too and enjoying the book. So glad we got to talk.
Melinda Gates' new book is The Moment of Lift. The other books we discussed today were Awakening Joy by James Baraz and Shoshana Alexander, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari, The Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead by Brene Brown.
Books of Your Life is produced by me, Elizabeth, with Melissa Yeager Miller, and with help from Danny Fakis and Sybil Wallace.